Welcome back to another part in the MVVM Jetpack Compose course for beginners. And in this part, we're going to work on navigating, well, I guess fragment navigation in general. And we're going to kind of hone in on one topic in particular, and that's how to pass arguments or pass data from one fragment to another. So just as an example of what we're going to be trying to accomplish here, here's the finished version of the app. I have, a bunch of recipes in this list. When I click on one of these recipes, what happens? Well, we need to navigate to what's called a detail fragment. So when I click on this, it's going to load, and it loads, the featured image, the title, the updated at date, and then the ingredients in that recipe, and also the kind of recipe score over here. So what we need to do is perform fragment navigation, and we need to pass the ID of the list item that we clicked on, so that when we go to this detail screen, we can then query the API using that ID. And as the title of this video suggests, I'm going to be talking a little bit about this thing called Safe Args, or Safe Arguments is what it's actually short for. So Safe Arguments are I guess another feature built on top of navigation components that adds type safety to whenever you pass arguments to other fragments. If that sounded like magic and hocus pocus to you, essentially it just means like if you're passing data to another fragment from some fragment, it's going to check the data type. So if you're passing a string, it's going to restrict the data type to only pass strings. If it's passing an integer, it will restrict the data type to only passing integers. I think you get the idea. So I'm not going to be using safe arguments, and I'm not going to be using safe arguments for a number of reasons. Number one is I think it's really just unnecessary. It reminds me a little bit about data binding, not about functionality wise similar to data binding, but just in the fact that I think it's totally unnecessary. I really think that like creating a bundle, attaching some kind of an argument, and then just passing the bundle to the fragment is perfectly fine. In the fragment, when you get those arguments from the bundle, you can perform a type check if you want to right there. I really think safe arguments is really just mostly unnecessary. And it also it's another library, another sort of bunch of code that you have to add to your project. It also does a bunch of code generation. So if you look at the documentation, which I might as well pull up for you right now. So here we are in the documentation, guide, navigation, pass data. So here's the documentation and here's where it shows you how to pass arguments to different fragments using navigation components. So here you can see like in the nav graph, you would define an argument in the fragment. And then you would, if you keep scrolling down here, it'll say, add safe arguments to your project. So that's like right here. You have to add this class path to your build.gradle project file, add a new plugin, and there you go. A bunch of magic will happen. You get some code generation, and you can attach arguments like this. So if your action was called confirmation action, which navigated to some other fragment, you would just pass the argument right here. So it kind of gives you like a function, I guess, that you can attach to this class that gets generated. And I don't know, somehow this is easier than just creating a bundle and attaching it to the bundle. I really do not see how this is any easier. So I know this might be triggering some of you. Some of you might like to use safe arguments, and I have to say I'm pretty uneducated about it. I just looked at it and I said, okay, let's add this thing, try it out, and it didn't seem like it saved me any time or effort, so I don't use it. So if maybe there's something I don't know, if there is, leave a comment down below and tell me about how ignorant I am and how I don't know what I'm talking about, because I don't know, I just don't see it. So anyway, that's enough talking. That's enough talking about why I'm not going to use safe arguments. Now let's just go and write the code, navigate to the new fragment, and use the good old-fashioned way of creating a bundle, attaching arguments to the bundle, and then getting them when we go to that next fragment. So before we work on the navigation, I want to clean this up a little bit. I got some comments in some of the older videos or the previous videos that this looks really, really ugly. And I agree, because it does look ugly, but it's ugly because my font size is so big. Like if you go to my font size, I've cranked it up to like 52. Usually when I code, it's at like 33. So this looks much nicer. This is much more manageable, but it just doesn't look good on video. So I'm cranking this up to like 52 so you guys can see better, which makes it look super ugly. So we can clean this up though. We can abstract out this into some other composables so you guys can get kind of a better view. So what we're going to do is go into, well, first, I guess I'll explain what we're going to do. So currently we have our recipe list here, in our lazy column. We're going to create a recipe list composable and kind of pull this all out so it looks a little better. It's just to clean things up. Use that, state hoisting thing that they always talk about in the documentation for Jetpack Compose. So let's go into components, right click, go to new column file, and call this recipe list. So create that, and now let's create that new composable. So at composable, like we do with every other composable function, we'll call it recipe list, and this will take a whole bunch of arguments. We need basically everything. Well, here, I'll actually show you how I usually do this if I'm going to abstract something out. So I'll do it, in sort of a practical way instead of just writing it out here. So go into recipe list fragment, and suppose I wanted to abstract out everything inside of this box. Well, first I'd find the bracket, scroll down, grab everything that's inside the box, cut it, come into recipe list and paste it in. And now I just want to look here and I want to say, okay, what's red? And those red things are what we need to pass as arguments to the function. So the first one is loading, which is a Boolean. Second is a list of recipes. So there's our list of recipes. Whoops, need to close that and go next line. Get that recipe import. Next is the view model. So when you're doing state hoisting, when you're applying this state hoisting sort of pattern that they advertise in the Jetpack Compose documentation, they say don't pass objects to the functions, pass the functions themselves. So this is executing a function on change recipe scroll position. So what I'm going to do is copy that name, come up to the top here, and do on change recipe scroll position. This will be a function which will take a integer, and it will return nothing. So now I have this function up here. I'm actually going to tab. I should probably tab everything in. This looks kind of funny. This whole thing should get tabbed in. No, what is going on? Just this needs to be tabbed in. There we go. So there we have our function now. So now instead of view model on change scroll position, I can get rid of that view model call, and then there we go. We have our function here. Next will be the page. So this is an integer. So I can just do page integer. Next, we have another function. So this is the onTrigger event function. So again, I'm going to copy the name of the function, come up here, paste it in. This will be a function that takes an event as input. So I think it's recipe list event is the argument, and then it's going to return nothing. So now I can come here and I can delete this view model call. There we go. We have another kind of function in here. This is giving me a warning telling me that I'm using something experimental. So just press Alt Enter on there. Get that annotation. That's going to get added to the top of the composable up here. Next, we have our default snack bar. Again, another warning telling me that I'm using something experimental. So get rid of that. Now we need the scaffold state. So scaffold state, get that object up here as an argument. And that's it. All right, so here's our sort of abstracted out recipe list function. Now I do need one last thing because we are going to be doing, I want to make sure that I sort of simulate the snack bar. I want to make sure I can actually trigger the snack bar to do something. So I'm going to add the snack bar controller also. So snack bar controller, and that way we can write some logic here and actually use the snack bar. So now inside of here where we have our recipe card, we have the recipe that's being passed as an argument. Now we want to work with this onClick function because when we click on a recipe, like if I go to the finished version of the app, when I click on a recipe, I want to initiate that navigation. So something needs to happen here. So inside of the onClick function, I'm going to write an if-else statement. So if else, I'm writing an if else because in the else, I want to do I want to simulate our snack bar so that we can actually test something. So I'm going to say snack bar controller dot get scope dot launch like we've done before in the previous videos, and then snack bar controller dot show snack bar. Then we have the scaffold state, so passing that up as the first argument. Then we have message equals, let's say recipe error, and then we'll do action label and just set that equal to OK. So there's no reason you need this. This is totally unnecessary. This is simply for demonstration purposes. So up inside of this else here, I'm going to say if recipe ID equals or does not equal null, then we will go to the next fragment. But if this recipe ID is null for some reason, we're basically just doing some error handling here, which is never going to happen. None of the recipes have a null ID, but if if it happened to happen, which is not possible, then at least the user would see some kind of an error instead of, nothing happening. Now we're going to do the good old fashioned way to pass arguments to another fragment. We're going to create a bundle. So just get that import, call it bundle. Now do bundle.put integer, put integer. The key here will be the recipe ID, and then we can just do recipe.id. Now we need to do the navigation. So because we're using navigation components, we need the nav controller to do the navigation. And because we've abstracted out into a separate composable, to get access to the nav controller, we have to pass it as an argument to the function. So there's our nav controller. Now I can do nav controller.navigate and then just reference the action. So r.id.viewRecipe, and that's going to look a little weird to you, so don't worry, I'm going to show you where that came from. And then you just pass the bundle as the second argument. So a couple things here if you guys are not familiar with navigation components. Number one is this is how you navigate with fragments using navigation components. You're calling the navigate function on this thing called the navigation controller, which you can get in any fragment or any activity. And then you reference the ID of the action. So what is this? What is this action? Well, I'll remind you. We talked about this earlier in the course, but it was quite a while ago. So if you go into resources, go into navigation, go into main graph, here's our graph that contains, all of our fragments. If you go to the design tab, this is what it looks like. This is what the XML, gets translated to. We have recipe list fragment and we have recipe fragment. And then there's this very important arrow that kind of points between the two. This arrow is an action. So if we go to the code, this is the arrow right here, this action. The ID is view recipe. So does that look familiar? Yes, that's this right here, view recipe. So I'm defining the action. The destination is recipe fragment. So this action exists inside of recipe list fragment, and it's going to take me to recipe fragment. The ID of it is view recipe. So that's how the navigation is working. It's very simple, calling navigate, referencing the action, and then the second argument here is the bundle. So that's how we're going to get that recipe ID inside of a recipe fragment. So there we go. We have our recipe list composable. Now we can go into recipe list fragment and we can use this thing. So down here where the box used to be, now I can just write recipe list and I have access to all of those parameters. So obviously loading is loading, recipes is just the recipes. Whoops. Oh man, that was some bad typing. There's recipes. Now on change recipe scroll position, this is a function that gets delegated to our view model. So view model : on change recipe scroll position. The page is just the page. The on trigger event, that's another one. Oh no, that's when we actually have to call. So I'm going to open this up, go to the next line, and I'm going to tab. Ooh, those tabs are weird. This should be like tabbed over here. I don't know what's going on with the tabs with Jetpack Compose sometimes. Seems to go in weird positions. So I want to call view model on trigger event. Now this is the next page event. So that is, whenever we trigger our pagination. I guess I could call this something different, like on next page or something like that. Instead of on trigger event, that would probably make more sense. Like on next page, that would probably make more sense. So on next page and on next page. That naming makes more sense. Now the scaffold state is just the scaffold state. The snack bar controller is just the snack bar controller. And then the nav controller. So how do we get the nav controller in a fragment? Well, it's very simple. Just write find nav controller. It's the same thing in an activity, but there's also more complicated scenarios that can come up with navigation components. But generally speaking, for simple scenarios, it's always going to be just find the navigation controller. Last but not least, we're going to go into recipe fragment. So go into recipe fragment. And now we need to set this thing up to receive the argument from the bundle when we navigate to it. So just for kind of demonstration purposes, I'm going to keep track of the recipe ID at the top. So for starters, I'm going to set it to -1. Now I'm going to insert the onCreate function. So for those of you who don't know what I just did to pull up this window, I'm pressing Control-O. Now I have access to all of the override functions that are available inside of the fragment class. Scroll down to, whoops, I think I passed it, the onCreate function. This one right here that takes just the saved instance state as input. So grab that one. Now go to the next line. Now to get arguments, I just write arguments, ? So I'm checking if they're not null. Now I want to do get integer because that's the type of argument that we attached. Remember that recipe ID was an integer. Now I'm checking for it using a special key, the recipe ID key. Remember, if we go to recipe list, that's the key that I specified right here. So just checking for that. Now I'm going to check if that thing is null by doing !.let. So if it is not null, then I'm going to have access to this recipe ID value right here that's being passed as an argument into the Lambda. And in that case, then I would do this.recipe ID, so referencing this, and then that equals the recipe ID. Just to kind of make this a little bit more clear, I could call this RID, and then just do recipe ID equals RID. That would make it a little bit more clear for you. So now how do we know, like when we run the app, how do we know that we actually got this recipe ID? Well, let's write some code down here so we can actually see it. So instead of saying, this is recipe fragment, I'll say something like selected recipe ID, and then just do that recipe ID. So there's that global value up there. So what we expect to see is, I could actually make this a little better. I could do like, recipe ID, if that, I could set it to equal to null. So let's do this. Let's set this equal to null by default. And then that way, here, I'll delete this so it looks a little better. So if the recipe ID does not equal null, then it'll say selected recipe ID and just do that recipe ID. But if it is null, in that case, I want to do ::. That means like, this is like the else case. So I'm saying if it's not null, then do this. If it is null, then do this. I'm saying loading, .. So if it's not null, we'll see selected recipe ID and see that recipe ID. If it is null, then it's going to see loading. So we expect to see like when the fragment first comes into view, we should see loading ... because it's going to be null to start with. But after you get the recipe ID, which is going to be pretty much immediate actually from onCreate, then we expect to see that we'll see that ID. Just to show actually a delay, what I could do is, I don't know, coroutine scope, do main.launch. So I'm just launching a coroutine on the main thread. You don't have to worry about this stuff. I'm just kind of doing it for demonstration purposes anyway. And I can do like delay, and let's delay like 500 milliseconds. So that way, at least we're going to see, well, we can even delay a second. Let's do a 1 full second, and then it'll get the argument. So that way, at least we'll see this loading. Otherwise, it's going to be too fast and we won't see it. Okay, so let's run this and take a look. Okay, here we have the app in view. Now I can click on any one of these recipes. Let's click on this easy crock pot pulled pork. So when I click on this, we expect to get taken to the new fragment, and we should see that loading text up in the top left. And then after 1 second, we should see the recipe ID for this recipe. So if I click on it, there's loading, and I never see the recipe ID, it looks like. So what does that mean? I think the problem here is I didn't do this the compose quote unquote way, because right now I have a variable, but it's just a variable. This needs to be like a mutable state value. So I could do, let's do mutable state and do integer, and then do mutable state of, and it will be null to start out. You can't have a null integer, so let's do -1 then. And then do recipe ID.value equals RID, and now this will react. So I got to change this logic though. It's got to be like if the recipe ID.value does not equal -1, then do selected recipe ID and do recipe ID.value. But if, and then so I could do else. Let me actually surround this in a bracket, and then I'll do else. So next line else. So I don't know why compose does this weird like spacing thing there. See, like this should be here, but whatever. And then I'll do loading ... So that one should be good. So now if the recipe ID does not equal -1, we get the ID, otherwise show loading. Yeah, that it was working technically, like we were getting the ID, but the composable was not getting recomposed because we weren't using something that it knows how to, watch. So let's try that again. We have the app running over here. Now let's click on the same one. We'll go easy crockpot. There's loading, and then we get the selected recipe ID number 3. Let's try a different one. So if I go back, let me click on this one. Loading recipe ID number 1. so we know that it is working as expected. So that's it. Now we are able to navigate from recipe list fragment to recipe fragment. We're able to pass the ID, which later we're going to use to query the API and get the rest of the information for whatever recipe was clicked on the list. Oh, and we also talked about safe arguments and why I think it's a waste of time to use safe arguments. I really don't see the dividend payoffs. But again, I'm ignorant. I will admit it that I haven't spent any time using it really. I just thought, I looked at it and I said, this doesn't seem worth it, so I don't use it. Convince me otherwise. Maybe some of you have different thoughts. I'm open to hear your thoughts. Leave comments down below. Tell me why you love safe arguments if you do. I seriously doubt there's a lot of you that do, but hey, you never know. Now in the next video, we're going to work on the view model for recipe fragment and the state events for recipe fragment. So similar to how we set up recipe list fragment. We have our view model, we have different events that we can trigger in there, and just generally setting it up to move to the next kind of stage in development. Do not forget your engagement. Don't forget your like. Remember, this course is free. You owe it to me to go down there, click that little gray thumb, turn it into a blue thumb, and leave me some kind of engagement. Tell me what you had for breakfast. Tell me what you had for lunch. Tell me your problems that you've been going through in your relationships. It doesn't even have to be about programming. Tell me anything you want. Go down there, leave me some engagement, and I'll see you in the next video. Hey, what are you still doing here? The video's over. Well, since you're still here, I guess I'll show you the best Android courses that exist on the planet. I got all kinds of high quality courses. If you scroll on down on the homepage, there's the Jetpack Compose one that you're watching right now. There's that course. We have MVI architecture, if you've ever been curious about that. We have my classic powerful Android apps with Jetpack architecture. This shows you everything from, the focus on this one is pretty much database caching. We get data from a real API, we cache it, we basically design an app to work when there's no network connection. That is what this project is all about. We have some UI testing, another UI testing, HILT, which we actually went over in this course. We got clean architecture. This one's probably the best. This is definitely the best course on my website. If you are a professional or you are looking to get into the industry, the skills that you learn in this course are absolutely fundamental. This will give you a big edge in any job environment, whether you're applying or you're already at a job and you want to just improve your skills. This is a really, really, really high quality course. It's hard. Your brain might explode while watching it, but you will learn a lot. You'll learn a lot of really, really fundamental skills. Anything from getting data from the network, caching data, designing different layers, abstracting out the different layers so that you can write unit tests, espresso tests, so UI tests, Dagger, navigation components, everything. It's beautiful. Definitely, this is the best course on the website.